Welcome to the Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Journalist, author, and fashion specialist Dana Thomas has been reporting on the latest trends and insights for over 30 years in the global fashion industry. Today, I catch up with Dana on the Left Bank in Paris, writing for British Vogue and the New York Times, and of course, taking the time to talk with me about the fashion retail industry and her third book, Fashionopolis, Why What We Wear Matters. In a wide-ranging conversation, we talk about the evolution of fashion retail from family-owned design houses to global corporations, the future of fast fashion, and what fashion retailers should do to ride the wave of a changing industry and consumer.
So, I love that it's becoming cool to recycle and rewear your clothes or remake them. Princess Beatrice took a dress that was the Queen's out of the archives and recut it as her own wedding gown. That's great. And that's just showing sort of that, these clothes can have a longer life, even if you're taking it to a tailor and changing it a bit, or maybe you're wearing it in a different fashion. Or
let's listen in now. Dana, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.
And I'm really looking forward to this. I read your book, and it just the sense, your comprehensive overview of the industry, but your passion clearly for fashion, both as a chronicle of the industry and yourself as someone who's really passionate about clothes, and it really weaves its way, so to speak, through the book. So really looking forward to the interview. Where am I finding you today?
I'm on the Left Bank in Paris in my apartment.
Ah, so nice.
In the home office.
How's the weather there? Is it?
It's glorious today. A glorious big blue sky and lots of sharp winter light.
Ah, fantastic. Well, I've been to Paris once and look forward to returning again. But what a wonderful place to be based. All right, well, let's jump right in. Tell us a little bit about your background and what you do for a living today.
Well, these days, I write for the New York Times regularly as a freelance contributor to the style section and any other part of the paper where I feel I have something to contribute. And I'm a contributing editor for British Vogue. And I'll be soon launching my own podcast called The Green Dream about sustainability. That's my New Year's project soon on the air. And I've been working in journalism for about 30 years. I began my career at the Washington Post in Washington under the legendary editor Ben Bradley, and was working in the style section, which was the writer's section of the writer's paper, and really learned everything I do there. I began covering fashion at the paper as an assistant to the fashion editor, though that was not my ambition. I had a great ambition to be the White House correspondent or a political correspondent or maybe at the State Department. But the fashion thing sort of was fun, and so I thought, why not? And I loved doing arts and culture as well. And then I married a Frenchman and moved to Paris. This is our 30th anniversary this year. And that's how I really became a fashion writer, because when you're in Paris, that's one of the big businesses that you need to write about. And I worked for Newsweek for 15 years here in the Paris bureau as the cultural and fashion correspondent for all of Europe. And that's at the time when fashion was switching from being small, independent, family-owned companies to big global conglomerations, publicly traded conglomerations. And I covered all that bit by bit as it was unfolding. So my first book, Deluxe, How Luxury Lost Its Luster, really details that switch from small, family-owned and run houses to global corporations. And I've written two other books. One's called Gods and Kings, The Rise and Fall of Alexander McQueen and John Galliano, and now Fashionopolis, The Price of Fast Fashion and the Future of Clothes.
Did you always want to be a writer? Like in the sandbox when you were a kid, where you were chronicling what was happening? Like where was that spark?
Well, I've known, pretty much for a long time. I don't know if I knew I wanted to be a journalist per se, though I did love reading our local paper on the Philadelphia Main Line. And we visited the local paper when I was a Girl Scout. And we took a school trip to see the Philadelphia Bulletin when I was a kid. And I thought that was pretty cool. But I did always want to be a writer. And I remember I wrote my first play when I was like 10 or 11 years old on a manual typewriter, and then produced it with my friends for a summer play at the beach. And we charged everyone a dime and then went out and bought ice cream.
Well, as I said in the beginning, we're here to talk fashion, specifically fashion and retail for my audience. And our jumping off point, as you said, is your book, Fashionopolis, What We Do or What We Wear Matters. Let's talk about the tradecraft of being an author. You're a professional writer. You write all the time.
I write all the time.
You write all the time, right? That's your gig. You have a big canvas: New York Times, British Vogue. What prompted you to write the book? What your second book? So you'd already had the experience.
Actually, my third book.
Third book. So you've clearly already had the experience of the process. What white space were you trying to fill on the shelf for this particular book?
Well, like everything I do, I'm always trying to figure out what's next. That's my job. I'm a writer, but as a journalist and a cultural journalist and I sort of see myself as a social anthropologist. I try to figure out what's coming next simply by paying attention, observing, talking to people, listening, reading. And for me, what was coming next was sustainability and what we call eco-ethics or conscious consumerism in the fashion business. And it was just little things here and there that I kept picking up, that I would see a small article about companies reshoring, bringing their manufacturing back to the United States into places like the Carolinas. And I thought, that's interesting. And so I clipped it and literally clipped it or, from the newspaper, or I print it out and I put it in a file on my desk. And I just, whenever something caught my attention, or, that there was a rise in organic cotton production and use, or I'd see an interesting story about a blue jeans company that has decided to do, real craftsmanship and heritage kinds of blue jeans with organic cotton and natural indigo. And I was like, that's really interesting. Or I read about the denim industry in Japan, and I thought, and how they do things the old-fashioned way. And they took all the old Levi's machines when the Levi's factories closed and moved them to Japan so they could do beautiful Levi's style jeans, but in Japan. And I thought, that's interesting. So I just sort of dropped all this stuff in this file and kept thinking about it and noodling it. And then it just suddenly came together as a proper proposal for my publisher, Penguin Press, where I said, the next thing that's coming, we talk about sustainability in the food business. And I'd been watching and reading about that, the organic movement in that realm. And I said, with the Kyoto Accords and the Paris Climate Agreement, this is the next place, because the fashion industry is not prepared whatsoever, and it has to pivot. And there are some sort of small places that are starting to pivot ahead and will pull the industry that direction. A lot of the reporting and work I did on the book was happening as, I was reporting things as they were happening. Like when I started working on the book, the company that I later write about that's spinning synthetic silk in laboratories and growing, mushroom root leather, mycelium, it didn't exist, or if it did exist, it wasn't doing that, or it hadn't gotten to that point yet. But in the 3 years that I worked on the book, some of these startups managed to get to a point where they were worth highlighting, and now they're becoming major corporations and major players in the fashion business. So it was really cool to be there. Like I went to see a factory in Manchester that I read about in one of the British papers that was spinning cotton for the first time, the first new cotton mill in the UK since World War II. And it turns out, I called them, I said, can I come see you? And they said, yes. And it turns out I was there the first day they were running the machines. So, it kind of was like a moving target in a sense, because I had to make sure that what I was writing about wasn't going to be outdated or somebody wasn't going to go under, which is a hard thing to do, especially before the pandemic. And actually, a few of the people I spotlight in the book didn't make it through the pandemic, sadly. But I know they'll be back and doing good work, if under another name, sometime soon. And and to highlight things like the rental business, I could see that was going to be growing fast. I was reading, banking studies and marketing studies and consulting reports saying that, rental is going to be on the rise. We predict it'll be this in 5 years and 10 years. And so that's when I said, right, we got to do something on that. And the same with resale and the whole rise of repair and reuse and recycling of clothing. So, just by reading the trades and following the consultancies and reports, but also getting out with my notebook like I do, an old school reporter, I really did dig down and find out what was happening and try to tell you what's coming down the pike and why you need to pay attention to it.
Well, so many thoughts out of that. Just that you basically follow breadcrumbs together and it comes together as a story. I mean, and it's another interesting wave of information, as a lot of these companies you mentioned, whether it's rental or whether it's recycle, are doing IPOs, and that's a whole other level of transparency into the business model, right? I mean, there's a whole other amount of information, and you're right about technology moving so fast. I was reading for one of my other podcasts on food, in Singapore, a lot of this, manufactured lab grown meat, which is, the technology to grow things from next to nothing. And your mycelium example is so fascinating.
Absolutely. One of the great success stories that I spotlight in the book and has just grown so wonderfully well is my very first reporting trip for the book was to Nashville, because I knew that Nashville was a hub for the fashion industry in America. You don't think of it that because it's such a music city, but it's actually also a fashion hub. Los Angeles is the largest manufacturing and fashion hub in America now, more than New York. New York is second and Nashville is third. So I went there and I met this lovely young woman named Sarah Bellows, who is first company to be growing and producing natural indigo in the United States in more than 100 years at a commercial level. There's lots of artisans doing it, but this is like at a commercial level to work with mills and get them to dyeing things. And she was really just getting going when I went to see her, and she had just landed her first major contract then with Cone Denim, which has since closed. But she has teamed up with Levi's, and they are now working to introduce natural indigo at mills for dyeing throughout the world, from this little Nashville startup to globally supplying the natural indigo to the entire denim industry. And you can switch out your synthetic indigo, which is very toxic, to natural indigo, and it will use the same machines. You don't have to do anything differently. And actually, hers is cheaper. So this is a huge, like she's grown so much in the 5 years since I went to see her. I'm really glad I got her in the book.
You mentioned Levi's. It comes up a few times in the book, and I worked for Levi's for a little bit. And I was there in the day where the philosophy was we're going to make product in every market that we sell it in. And you talk about that and the rollback. And I lived through some of those days. So talk about that a little bit, because I think it is a good example of the pressures that are under companies. And Levi's was a very, it's basically a family-based company that had very strong ethics, but was pulled in different directions by the dynamics of the industry.
Absolutely. And in fact, what happened is that Levi's brought in a CEO. It was the first non-family CEO in the 1990s. And he came from the soda industry. I think he ran Mountain Dew or something, and from PepsiCo or Coca-Cola. And he applied those same business stratagems to Levi's, and it was an utter disaster. He laid off 25,000 people in a matter of a year or two. He closed all of the factories in the United States. He changed Levi's from being a company that produced things to being a company that just designs and sells stuff, and they outsourced all of their production. And it's not that they just outsourced it offshore, but they just contracted. They got rid of their own factories, and they just hired independent contractors who had, who barely meet basic safety and health and human rights standards. And it really, really tarnished Levi's reputation as being an ethical company because the ethics were thrown out the window. But more than that, you could see the difference in the quality of the product. They also cut the quality of, in things like thread and yarn for weaving and the fabric and you could just see that it was not the same quality. And so sales went down, and they lost their sales to all these startup brands who were doing what they used to do, which was make beautiful, crafted, high quality, premium denim jeans. And they had to fight back to get that market back. They're back now because they brought in a wonderful CEO named Chip Bergh, who said, let's get the ship back on track where it was, and let's pull those ethics back into how we run the business. And
I remember the days because, I lived through it in the late 90s. I was part of it. It
was a disaster.
And the pressure, though, was, on the one hand, you had the Gap, who was on the rise. And on the other hand, you had a lot of designer jeans. And the feeling was we weren't moving fast enough. I mean, I lost track of the 50 whatevers, which is a whole other naming convention disaster. But the idea was we can't get out in front of these small designers, and it just I'm kind of picking on Levi's a little bit because it does capture the stress and pressures that are under mid-size fashion houses. I think to be fashion forward, but at the same time to kind of pull it together and be on price point as well, whatever their price point is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The irony, of course, and that's why I just wanted to spotlight them, was that blue jeans were the original sustainable garment.
Yeah,
they were built to last forever. They were created for miners crawling around in the rubble in silver and gold mines during the California gold rush. And they were passed down from miner to miner. When you struck gold, then you gave, your guys your old pants and you went back into town and lived it up and took a bath. So,
made with rivets, right? It's made with rivets. The pockets were riveted.
Yeah, those rivets were there for a purpose. They were to hold the pockets together for eternity. And every once in a while, an old pair is found. There was recently the oldest pair ever discovered was found in an old mine, and I think Levi's bought them for the archives. They're like 160 years old or something crazy like that. So the fact that Levi's compromised not only the integrity of the business and their ethics, but also of the product itself, which was made it the most polluting garment there was by using synthetic indigo that's made of, cyanide and formaldehyde and is incredibly toxic and is dumped into rivers and kills rivers. And then they were using, this conventional cotton, which is sprayed with herbicides and pesticides and maybe even
cotton's a big environmental disaster. It can be, right?
It can be. And might even be sourced from China, picked by forced labor by the Uyghurs. I mean, everything. They just turn, and then they want you to burn through them. They start making them out of a thinner denim so it doesn't last as long. And then, of course, pre-washing them so they don't last as long. In the old days when we bought our 501s, you sort of staggered your purchases of them because it would take you a good 6 months to break them in, right? So, but then when you did, they were fantastic. And my daughter still wears my old Levi's from the 80s, and they look great.
Well, they last forever, it's actually an interesting paradox because as you talk about a couple of times in the book, you're a consumer yourself, and it's fun to go shopping, and this durability element of fashion, it comes through in the tips. Your tips, what can you do at the end of the book? Is this paradox? Is I like fashion, I like shopping, but then some of these products last forever, and you don't need to shop. I loved your tip about shop your own closet. It gets to a point where close your eyes, go back into your closet. You might have what you're looking for already in the closet.
Exactly.
Now this goes against where you start the book talking about fast fashion, which has got its own dynamics. And you participate in that. I want something new. You start the book out talking about that. Where does your hopes stem in the industry? I mean, the industry is very complex. I mean, it's interesting that you wanted to cover, in your early days of journalism, you wanted to cover politics. I think the fashion industry is almost equally complex in terms of
it is politics and business. Right? That's what I realized when I was working on the fashion desk of the Washington Post, that in the end, fashion is politics and business as well. So, it completely makes sense. Now, what I hope for, is to go back to this idea that when we buy something, we buy it because we love it, and we want to have not just a lustful encounter with it, but we want to fall deeply in love and marry it, or at least have a really long love affair with it. And so. And not just clothes, but everything. That the whole idea of the throwaway culture becomes completely out of fashion. From your Bic pen and your Bic lighter to your H&M dress that only costs $9.99. That if a garment costs more to dry clean than you paid for it, you paid too little for it. You should not be buying. I mean, that's just trash, right? So
now is this influencer culture, Instagram? We know how important Instagram is. You're a journalist. New York Times is a fantastic digital property. The British Vogue as well. I was on the site, but is that in and of itself created a momentum spinning away from durability? Because I got to have something new on every image. Is that now inculcated into the culture so much that it's going to be tough to to get out of?
I think so, but we have some influencers who are doing this. And I have to say, it was funny because one of my colleagues at British Vogue said, when we were sitting at the fashion shows reading your book in the front row going, oh my gosh, what are we doing here? And, sort of having an existential crisis. And I thought, well, good, that's a good thing. And, but, there's my favorite movement is towards rewear by celebrities, the most famous being, of course, the Duchess of Cambridge, Kate Middleton, who rewears things all the time. And you'll see her in a McQueen coat at one event, and then she'll wear it as a coat. She'll wear it with pants, she'll wear it with a dress, she'll wear it for an official thing, she'll wear it at church, she'll wear it out, and that's great. And the same thing with some celebrities now. When Kate Blanchett was the president of the Venice Film Festival, everything she wore on the red carpet during those 15 days in Venice was something out of her closet that she'd worn somewhere before, except for one outfit, which was just for the event and then was auctioned off to benefit Venice. So, I love that it's becoming cool to recycle and rewear your clothes or remake them. I think it was Princess Beatrice took a dress that was the Queen's out of the archives and recut it as her own wedding gown. That's great. And that's just showing sort of that, these clothes can have a longer life, even if you're taking it to a tailor and changing it a bit, or maybe you're wearing it in a different fashion, or, they keep saying the 90s are back in fashion. Boy, is my daughter happy because I have a whole closet full of really great Gucci from the 90s. And she's like, yeah, I'm so glad you kept it, Mama. But that's because I bought things that were great to begin with, and I've kept them 20 years, and they still are in good shape, and they look cool.
Yeah, you were able to invest in. Now, as a retailer, we find new product, of course, spins the flywheel of success, right? What you see on the runway finds its way down into the shop floor, and that is what drives the industry and drives the economy. So can these things peacefully coexist together? This rewear? I
think so. I mean, there's a whole talk, not just in fashion, but in all of business, about degrowth, that we have to get to a point where we're producing less and sadly, making less money, but making less money in a better way. And so degrowth is, but particularly making less stuff, because we need to throw away less stuff. So you have to make something that lasts a long time, that is really worth investing in and paying more for. We've never paid less than we do today for clothes. People are like, I can't afford it to pay more for clothes. Actually, you can afford to pay more for clothes. You've just been conditioned to think you can't. And I say that because I've done some studies on this, and I cite them in the book, where, 30 years ago, we devoted far more of our annual household budget to clothes than we do today. Double digits versus single digits of percentage of our clothes. I can't remember exactly how much, but it was sort of, say, 14% of our annual budget was dedicated to buying clothes, and now it's about 5 or 6. So we're spending, but we're buying 5 times more clothes than we did 30 years ago on half the budget. So that tells you that we can actually afford to pay more for clothes. We've just been taught to believe, conditioned to believe, that it's normal to pay $20 for a dress, or even $1 or $2 for a bathing suit, which is just not true. If you do that, that means someone along the line is not getting paid what they should be paid. Actually, everybody along the line. And when you say you can't afford to pay more for clothes, you're actually contributing to your own budget cutting, because if you are devaluing what everybody along the supply chain does to make that dress, you don't think it's worth paying more than $20 for that dress. That means that everybody along the supply chain was not paid what they were worth. And you may, in your way, be part of that supply chain, or if not, you're still contributing to the devaluing of work. And that's a really important big to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to pull on that thread, so to speak, because you've got this realization. I think, I don't know. This is one question I wanted to ask you. So we've gone through a couple of years of the COVID era. Maybe we're in the last stretch of it. Who knows? But I have to think that that's had some impact on consumers shopping and buying behavior and psychology. I was reading a report by EY, and interviewed the author, and they talked about what you bring up a couple of times, conscientious consumption. And their conclusion from the data, global data, was that one of the impacts of the COVID era was that people are going to be more conscious or conscientious about what they spend, maybe spend the same amount, but as you describe, go up to good, better, and best. Do you think, from your observations, and I'm sure you've been writing about this, what do you think the COVID era is really going to do in the fashion industry? Do you think it will be that kind of, hey, that we're part of the supply chain. We are the decisions we make matter here and around the world. Do you think that's coming into consciousness more now?
I think it is, in part because I made a lot of noise, and my colleagues in the fashion industry who cover it from a more sociological point of view made a lot of noise about how some brands were not paying their bills in Bangladesh. I think it was $40 billion worth of bills that were not paid, and the clothes just sat on the docks rotting, and the people were sent home from the factories and they were starving. So there's been a lot of noise made about just the bad behavior of some fashion brands. But more than we all had hope that people's shopping behaviors would change, and then by September this year, so what, 2 or 3 months coming out of this pandemic, we thought, H&M and Zara's sales were back up to pre-pandemic levels. Like, we just went back to what we were doing. What's going to really change things is the Paris Climate Agreement and pivoting to a more sustainable world. And I went to COP26 in Glasgow and saw and listened to several people speaking on the subject, and went to panels and really got in and realized that this is the future, actually. And that's going to have more of an impact than a pandemic. The pandemic, it's a blip in history, but we're actually shifting the way businesses do business. We're going to get rid of polyester in the supply chain simply because it's made of petroleum, and we won't have the petroleum to make polyester. We're going to get rid of polyester because it's plastic. That's how we're going to make the changes. And therefore, we're going to have more organic cotton because we won't be allowed to, through all these deals, to lower the toxic impact of agriculture, to spray those herbicides and pesticides on the cotton anymore that makes it so toxic. And we're going to pivot to organic cotton because it's cleaner, and you'll get government subsidies to do so. That's how the business is going to change. It's not going to be because people said, "Oh, it's just not right to be shopping at Zara anymore," and we got to think more responsibly as a consumer. It's going to be forced on us.
Hence your podcast, right? I mean, basically,
exactly,
kind of where you're starting about. You spend a lot of time in factories where the product is made, and I have a bit of experience in what we call strategic sourcing. And I want to talk about these two philosophies. I want to see where you land on it. The philosophy one was we work with partners around the world, and sometimes they make mistakes or they do things that we don't like. And the two philosophies are one strike, you're out. You lock the door, you did whatever, we're going to move on. The second was we're going to work with you. We're going to tag you for it, but if we keep moving vendors, it's just going to move the same people around to different places, and we'll never really improve the situation. Do you have a perspective on which strategy? Like, if you were in the buying office of a major retailer and you discovered, unfortunately, that something you didn't like was happening in a factory around the world, would you say that's it, you're done, or would you say, listen, that's strike one, you have 2 more strikes, let's work together to figure it out? What would you do?
Oh no, I totally pull out.
No question. That's it.
No question, pull out. And in fact, I'd make sure beforehand, I'd do the due diligence beforehand and go visit and make sure that they were, I mean, I've visited factories in Bangladesh and in Vietnam, as I just discuss in the book. And, once you walk in, and I went to see this sweatshop. I was off the plane half an hour and I was already in a sweatshop. And there was a jeans company, a jeans brand I knew the name of being produced there. And I think they have no idea their clothes are being made in that sweatshop. I think that they have somebody on the ground who does all their sourcing for them, who hooked them up and said, this place is, and you go on the website and the website makes the place look fantastic. And, you're halfway around the world and you're like, okay, this is why I pay my man on the ground. So I trust him. Yeah. No, you got to go do the due diligence yourself. You got to go to if you're going to produce in Bangladesh, you got to go look at your factory. Tommy Hilfiger was horrified to learn that his clothes were being made in Bangladesh. He didn't even know they were, and they were. And then the factory caught on fire, and he said, "We will never let this happen again." He didn't know anything. If you're going to put your name on the label, you should know where your clothes are being made and who's making them, and you should get on the plane and go.
It's actually on a side note, it's a bit tougher these days. I was talking to some retailers, and it's just tougher to get on a plane and go to these places in the COVID era. And it is one of the things they're worried about. Is, as you say, buyers, when they buy stuff, they don't want to see samples in the hotel room. They want to walk the floor because they understand the connection between. They want to see where it's made. They don't want to buy from a sample because that gets, trouble can follow from that.
And wonderfully, the state of California just passed a law that is holding brands now accountable for human rights and labor infractions in the state of California. If you are not paying minimum wage to your workers in a factory, in a sweatshop in California, generally, brands would say, "Oh, we didn't know, it was subcontracted, we lost track of the supply chain," which is bunk because they know everything about everything all the time. And it's in the same town. If you can't keep track of your supply chain within the city limits, you've got a serious problem. So, they're now saying, well, the brands used to say that's not our problem and take it up with the guy who owns the factory. But now the state of California.
Do you think a lot of brands, after Raina and after all these things, at a minimum, I think a lot of brands, do you think they think like that? I think at a minimum, they worry that the market says our brand will be tarnished even if they're not thinking of the humanity behind it.
Yeah, no, it's just about money. So now, and that's what the state of California said. It's just about money. Therefore, if your factory is paying everybody $2 an hour and the minimum wage is $15 an hour, we are now holding the brand responsible for that extra $13 an hour per person. Ouch. So that makes them find out where their clothes are being made and everyone's being treated properly. If the place is a death trap, if it's a fire trap, they're going to be held responsible. It's not just the factory owners, it's also the brands. This is huge. Now, why is this huge? It's California. California is what? The 6th largest economy in the world? And it's one of the largest, it's the largest garment
largest
center
in America, right? As you say in
the United States. And they're holding this accountable within California, but I think it's even at some point they're going to then say, if you're importing your clothes to California, you got to meet our standards. They're drawing up laws like that in Europe. Germany's is negotiating or debating a law like this, where they're saying if you're going to import stuff to Germany, you have to make sure your factories meet German standards, not just Bangladeshi standards, which are so substandard. And that's really, really, these are big laws and regulations that will have an enormous impact on the business and needed, quite frankly, needed.
Well, you give out some advice and some tips at the end of your book. What's your advice to retailers who are listening around fashion? I mean, it's a big industry. There's, these are, my listeners are in the retail industry. They're, whether they're Levi's or whether they're a brand you would know, whether they're a Canadian brand, they're trying to satisfy their customers. They're trying to, spin the flywheel of the economy. They're doing all these things. They're connected to fashion. What's your advice to the retailers listening around the fashion industry?
Well, I mean, it's really simple, I think. It's, there's a lot of talk about traceability and transparency now, and transparency is a new big buzzword that, you need to be transparent. Well, why aren't you transparent? Are you hiding something? If you're hiding something, you should ask yourself, why are we hiding this? What are we hiding? Otherwise, you should make everything available to your consumers to know, because there's nothing worth hiding. That's a really crazy thought, right? But if you think about it, it's not. But business has never told consumers what this is really made of or how this was really made, because why? They're hiding stuff from you. So if you're not transparent, you should ask yourself why. And if you're a retailer and you're carrying a brand and they're not being upfront with you, you should ask why. And if they're unable to be 100% upfront with you and offer the supply chain from beginning to end, you might want to question working with them, quite honestly. I'm working on a piece right now about traceability and digital IDs. Prince Charles has come up with, is launching or has just launched at the G20 a digital ID that will track trace the life of a garment from factory floor to beyond. There's another company called Provenance in the UK that's doing it from field to form, as we say, or dirt to dress. So not only, and there's a great company in the UK called Sheep Inc., where they can take that sweater. There's a little tag on your sweater, and you can find out not only where the wool came from, but from what sheep it came from, and when it was sheared, and when it got its vaccinations, and you can adopt your sheep. So I think that retailers should be more open to working with brands that are transparent and be hesitant to work with those who aren't. It's not just about fashion and what it looks like, but it's also about the product's integrity. And conscious consumerism is about integrity from top to bottom. And I think that that's what we lost in globalization, and particularly the globalization of the fashion industry, is the integrity of the product and the integrity of the message and the integrity of the brand and the company, that they sacrifice their integrity for the sake of profit. And if you really want to be modern and be providing conscious consumerism products that they can purchase without worry and have true eco-ethics, then integrity is the most important element.
Well, my guest is Dana Thomas. The book is Fashionopolis, Why What We Wear Matters, your third book. Where can folks keep up with your day-to-day? You talked about New York Times and British Vogue. Are you on Insta, the platforms, and you're launching a podcast?
Instagram and Twitter, my handle is at Dana Thomas Paris. And when I came up with that, my husband said, "But what if we don't live in Paris?" And I said, "My darling, Paris is a state of mind."
Very good. Well, listen, thanks so much for joining me on The Voice of Retail. It's a great discussion. Fantastic. Such an interesting industry under such change, and so great to talk to you about it. And I look forward to listening to your podcast and following you. So once again,
The Green Dream with Dana Thomas coming in 2022.
Thanks for tuning into this special episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, be sure and click and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically twice a week. And check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Conversations with Commerce Next podcast, and the Food Professor podcast with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois. Last but not least, if you're into barbecue, check out my all-new YouTube barbecue show, Last Request Barbecue, with new episodes each and every week. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of M.E. LeBlanc Company and Maven Media. And if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at meleblanc.co. Have a safe week, everyone.